I'm Brandon, and at 27, I've always been the quiet one in the family. I'm the guy who steers clear of confrontation, who never pushes back against my parents' lectures, and who absolutely refuses to let them see how much their words cut. At least, that's how it used to be. The night everything changed started like any other, an ordinary Sunday dinner at my parents' house, where everyone gathers around the big oak table to eat, gossip, and, inevitably, compare me to my older brother, Mark. Mark is a golden child. He's 30, married to the kind of picture-perfect woman my mother loves to brag about, and he just got promoted to senior manager at his firm. He's the kind of person whose accomplishments get framed and hung in the hallway. Meanwhile, I'm the one who, according to them, took too long to get his life together. It doesn't matter that I work full-time, pay my own bills, and have been covering a good chunk of their mortgage ever since Dad's hours got cut 3 years ago. To them, Mark is a successful one, and I'm the project they never quite finished. I usually just sit through these dinners, picking at my food and letting the conversation wash over me. But tonight, the tension was thicker than usual. Mom had made her famous pot roast, and as soon as I sat down, I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me. My brother was talking about his new SUV, something he just had to buy to match his promotion, of course, and Dad was nodding proudly, like he'd raised a perfect son. Then Dad turned to me. "So, Brandon," he said, that familiar edge in his voice, "when are you going to start making something of yourself? Maybe take some notes from your brother here." I swallowed my bite of roast, trying to keep my voice even. "I am making something of myself, Dad. I've been working 2 jobs this year." Mom scoffed softly, as if I just made a bad joke. "You still rent. Honey, you should be saving for a house by now." That one stung, mostly because the only reason I wasn't saving for a house was because I'd been quietly helping them keep this one. But, of course, they never talk about that part. The conversation kept spiraling from there. My brother chiming in with unhelpful advice, Mom pointing out how I never stick with anything, and Dad finally snapping. He put his fork down, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Stop embarrassing this family and learn from your brother." I don't know what came over me, but I set my glass down, leaned back, and said, "Fine. He can cover the mortgage from now on." The room went silent. Mark blinked, confused, and Mom froze, her hand hovering in midair, like she'd just seen a ghost. "What mortgage?" she asked carefully. "The house is paid off, right?" My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the bank statements I'd brought with me, just in case tonight went the way I thought it might. I slid them across the table, without saying a word. Mom's face went pale as she read them, and Dad's jaw tightened. Mark looked between us, clearly lost. The air in the room felt heavy, like we were all waiting for something to explode. And that's when I saw it, just for a second, in my mom's expression. Not fear, not shock, but guilt. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. This was going to be the night everything finally came out. I just didn't know yet how ugly it was going to get. I didn't say anything right away. I just sat there and let the silence stretch, my glass still in my hand, letting them squirm. Mom finally set the statements down on the table, but she didn't look at me. She was staring at Dad, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked, her voice just barely above a whisper. Dad's ears turned red, a sure sign that he was about to blow. "Because it wasn't your business," he snapped. And then, when he realized how that sounded, added quickly, "I had it under control. I didn't need anyone else sticking their nose in." Mom didn't look convinced, and neither did Mark, but they both turned their attention back to me. "Brandon," Mom said, "why would you keep this a secret? We could have figured something out as a family." That one almost made me laugh. As a family? Where was this sudden team spirit? Every other time I'd been drowning in bills, quietly covering for them so they could keep living like nothing was wrong. I took a breath, trying to keep my voice calm. "I kept it a secret," I said, "because if I didn't, we'd all be having this conversation 3 years earlier, and I'd still be sitting here getting told I'm a disappointment. Except back then, we probably would have lost the house." Mark frowned. "Wait, hold on. You're saying you've been paying their mortgage this whole time?" "Yes," I said, meeting his eyes. "Half of it every month. plus utilities when they fell behind. The only reason this house is still in our family is because I worked every overtime shift I could get. For a moment, Mark actually looked stunned, like he was seeing me for the first time. But Dad just grunted like I'd said something mildly inconvenient and reached for his glass. Well, you live here rent-free. It's only fair you contribute. That was it. That was the match. Rent-free? I repeated, my voice sharper now. You've been treating me like a tenant this whole time, nagging me to keep the house spotless, acting like I owe you my time every time something breaks, and now I find out I've basically been paying to keep a roof over your heads. Mom tried to shush me, saying something about tone and respect, but I wasn't done. Do you have any idea what it's been like? I said, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Working double shifts, skipping nights out with my friends, saying no to everything I wanted to buy for myself because every month I knew there was a payment due on this house. And the whole time you two just sat back and let me be the family screw-up. You could have said no. Dad shot back. Nobody forced you. That hit me like a punch to the chest. Nobody forced me. That was the part he didn't get. Of course, nobody forced me. But what was I supposed to do? Watch them lose everything? Watch my mom cry while a bank takes the house she raised us in? You're unbelievable. I said, my voice low now because I could feel my anger shifting into something colder. I've been saving your reputation, not embarrassing it. And you've been using me as your punching bag. For the first time, Mom looked guilty. Really guilty. She reached across the table like she wanted to take my hand, but I had to pull back. Mark cleared his throat and said, Look, maybe we could just calm down. No, I interrupted. I think we should finally talk about this, because I'm done being quiet one. And that's when it all started pouring out. Mom started talking about how stressful it had been for them to keep up appearances, how their friends would have talked if they'd known they were struggling, and how grateful they were. Though she didn't seem very grateful now for my help, but she quickly turned around, saying, You should have told us you were feeling this way sooner. You know how we worry about you. You shut us out, Brandon. I almost laughed again. You worry about me? Mom, you spent every family dinner for the past 5 years comparing me to Mark. Every single one. I can quote half the things you say by heart. Mark just got another promotion. Mark just bought a house. Mark and Lisa are trying for a baby. Do you know what it feels like to sit here and hear about everything he's doing right while you act like my life is one long failure? Mark shifted uncomfortably. Bran, no. Let him say it, Dad said, crossing his arms. You want me to say it? I asked. Fine. I feel like I'm just your safety net. I'm good enough to write a check when you're in trouble, but never good enough to make you proud. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't bother me. The table was dead silent. Mom looked like she wanted to cry, but she didn't. Dad looked furious. And Mark actually looked ashamed, which surprised me. Then Dad said, Maybe if you were more like your brother, we wouldn't be in this situation. There it was. The line that sent everything over the edge. Maybe if you were more like a father, I shot back. You wouldn't have let it get this bad in the first place. That did it. Dad slammed his hand on the table hard enough to rattle the glasses. Watch your mouth. But I didn't flinch this time. Or what? I asked, and this time my voice was calm. You can't take anything from me. You already took 3 years of my life. Mark finally stepped in, telling Dad to cool off. But it was too late. The dam had broken. Mom got up from the table, muttering about how she couldn't do this right now. And Dad stormed off to the living room. I stayed seated, my hands still gripping the table, my pulse hammering. Mark lingered behind. Brandon, he said quietly. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know you were doing all that. I know you didn't, I said. It's not about you, Mark. It never was. But you let them use you as a yardstick, and it's been killing me. He nodded slowly, like he finally got it. What are you going to do? He asked. I didn't answer right away because the truth was, I didn't know yet. All I knew was that I wasn't going to sit at that table again, silently taking it. When I left that night, I didn't say goodbye. I just grabbed my jacket and walked out. But as I drove home, the anger started to settle into something sharper, something that felt like resolve. Because if they thought tonight was bad, they had no idea what was coming. When I got back to my apartment that night, I barely slept. My mind kept replaying everything that had been said at the table. The way Dad's jaw clenched, the way Mom avoided my eyes, the way Mark just sat there absorbing the fallout like it wasn't hitting him. 2. I told myself I was done. Done bailing them out. Done playing the villain in a story I didn't write. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The next morning, I got my answer. I had just finished making coffee when my phone buzzed with a notification from the bank. It wasn't payday, and I hadn't made any big purchases, so I knew something was wrong before I even opened it. My stomach dropped as I read the message. Your scheduled transfer has been processed. $1,350 withdrawn, the mortgage payment. Except I hadn't scheduled it this month. Last night was supposed to be the last time I paid for anything connected to that house. I pulled up my banking app and scrolled through the transaction details. Sure enough, it was set up as a recurring payment, one that apparently hadn't been canceled like I thought when I called the bank last week. Or maybe it had been reactivated. I stared at the screen, my pulse rising. My parents had access to my bank info because 3 years ago, when this all started, I'd set up the payments through their account and linked it to mine. It was supposed to make things easier. No late fees, no missed deadlines. I'd completely forgotten that they technically still had permission to authorize transfers, and now it looked like they had. I drove back to their house that afternoon, not even sure what I was going to say. Mark's car wasn't in the driveway, which was a small mercy. Mom opened the door when I knocked. Her expression guarded like she'd been expecting me. "Brandon," she said softly, "you should have called first." "Why?" I asked, stepping inside. "So you could make sure Dad wasn't here to answer the door?" Her lips tightened, but she didn't deny it. I went straight to the kitchen and put my phone on the counter. The transaction details pulled up on the screen. "Care to explain why money just came out of my account this morning?" She hesitated, then sighed. "We thought you might have acted out of anger last night. Your father didn't want the payment to lapse just because you were upset." I blinked, stunned. "So, you just decided to take my money anyway?" "It's for the house, Brandon," she said quickly, as if that made it better. "You've always said you didn't want us to lose it." That was before I interrupted, my voice rising. "Before I realized you were using me. Before I realized you'd rather let me break my back to save this place than admit we were in trouble. You had no right." She flinched, but didn't look away. "Your father is under a lot of stress right now. If the house goes into default, it will destroy his credit. And then what will happen? He can't retire. We can't sell. So, you just take my money without asking?" Her face hardened. "You don't understand the pressure he's under." "No, Mom." I cut her off, my voice shaking now. "You don't understand what you've done. You stole from me. Do you get that? You went into my account and helped yourself." That's when Dad walked in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "What's all this yelling about?" I turned to face him. "Did you authorize that transfer this morning?" His expression didn't even flicker. "Of course I did. Someone had to be the adult in the room." "The adult?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think being an adult means taking money from your own kid behind his back? I told you last night I was done. You don't get to decide otherwise." "It's not just your money, Brandon," he said, his tone turning sharp. "This is about family. You've always lived here, eaten our food, used our water. This is your responsibility." "No," I said, shaking my head. "That stopped being true the minute you went behind my back." "Don't be dramatic," Dad said. "It was one payment." "It's theft," I shot back. We stood there in the kitchen, staring at each other like two strangers. Mom tried to defuse it, saying something about finding another way, but I barely heard her. All I could think about was how casually he said it, how he didn't even feel bad. Then he said something that turned my anger into something darker. "You should be grateful," he said, his voice low. "Most kids don't get a chance to keep their child at home. You'll inherit this place one day. You should want to protect it." I stared at him, my mouth dry. "Inherit it?" Of course, he said. Your brother has his own house now. This one will go to you, but only if it's still standing when we're gone. So, yes, you're going to keep helping whether you like it or not. And there it was. Not a request, a statement, a decision made for me without my consent. You think you can just decide that? I asked, my voice quiet now. Dad shrugged. It's already decided. Something inside me shifted then. Up until that moment, I'd been angry, but some part of me had still wanted to fix things, to make them understand, to make them see me. But hearing him say it like that, like I was just an ATM with no say in my own life, flipped a switch in me. I didn't say another word. I just turned, walked out of the kitchen, and left. As I got into my car, I realized my hands were trembling. Not from anger, at least not just anger. This was something colder, sharper, a clarity I hadn't felt before. They had just made it perfectly clear. This wasn't about family or love or respect. It was about control, and I was done letting them have it. That night, I stayed up until 3 a.m. going through every piece of paperwork I could find. Bank statements, mortgage documents, every single receipt I'd saved since the day I started covering their payments. By the time the sun came up, I had a folder an inch thick with evidence of everything I contributed. I didn't know yet exactly what I was going to do with it, but one thing was certain. The next time I saw my parents, I wouldn't just be walking into their house as their son. I'd be walking in as someone they couldn't control anymore. The next few weeks were some of the hardest I've ever lived through. After that last confrontation, I cut off almost all contact with my parents. I didn't block their numbers, though I thought about it more than once, but I stopped answering their calls. When they texted me asking for an update or reminded me about the next payment deadline, I left them on read. At first, the silence felt like a relief, like finally taking a deep breath after years of being underwater. But the quiet has a way of turning on you. The apartment felt colder than usual. The walls seemed to close in every night when I came home from work. And the silence that used to feel comforting now just made me feel hollow. There was a part of me that wondered if I'd gone too far, if maybe I should have just swallowed my pride and kept things going the way they were. After all, it wasn't like I didn't want them to have a roof over their heads. The worst part was how much I missed my brother, Mark. He texted me a couple of times in the first week, saying he wanted to talk, but I couldn't bring myself to answer him. I didn't trust that he wouldn't run back to them with everything I said, and I didn't trust myself not to spill my entire plan before it was ready. Work wasn't much of a distraction either. I still pulled my shifts and did what I had to, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Every time a customer complained about something minor, every time a coworker made a lazy joke about me living with mom and dad, I felt my jaw tighten. Nobody knew what I was carrying. Nobody knew that the kid they thought was struggling to launch had been secretly holding up his parents' entire world. The emotional weight started to take a physical toll. I lost almost 5 pounds without trying, my appetite barely there. Nights became an endless cycle of replaying old arguments in my head, thinking about every little thing they'd said over the years, every comparison to Mark, every sigh of disappointment, every casual reminder that I wasn't measuring up. It was like all the hurt I'd swallowed for years was finally catching up to me. I think that's why, 2 weeks in, I found myself driving by their house late one night. I didn't go in. I just parked a couple of blocks away and sat there with the engine off, staring at the faint glow of the porch light. Part of me wanted to march right in and demand they apologize. Another part wanted to turn the car around and never come back. Instead, I just sat there until my coffee went cold, then drove home again. A few days later, Mark showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't answer the door, but he kept knocking until I did. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping much either. "Bran," he said as soon as I opened the door, "we need to talk." I let him in, though I didn't say much. We sat at the kitchen table, and he started telling me how things had been at the house, how Dad was angrier than ever, how Mom cried one night because the payment was coming up and she didn't know what they were going to do. "I'm not telling you this to guilt you," Mark said carefully. "I'm just saying they're scared. I don't think they expected you to actually walk away." "They should have," I said quietly. He sighed. "You've got to know they're not handling this well. I'm not either. I didn't know you were doing all that for them. Brandon, But now that I do, I can't stop thinking about how unfair it's been. For a second, I thought he might actually take my side, but then he said, maybe just one more month, just to give them time to figure things out. I almost laughed, but it came out sounding more like a choke. 1 more month, Mark? I've been saying, just 1 more month, for 3 years. That's how we got here. He didn't argue, but I could tell he wanted to. They're your parents, he said finally. Yeah, I said, standing up and walking to the counter where I'd left that folder of documents. And these are the records of every single time I saved them, every receipt, every transfer. Do you think they've kept a single one? Do you think they'd even believe me if I didn't have proof? Mark looked at the folder, like it was radioactive. What are you going to do with that? I don't know yet, I admitted, but I know I'm done letting them rewrite history. If they want to act like I've been freeloading this whole time, I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. He didn't say anything to that. He just stood up, gave me a long look, and left. After he was gone, I sat back down and opened the folder again. I spread everything out across the table, one page after another, until it was all in front of me. Seeing it laid out like that was overwhelming. 3 years of my life in black and white. Thousands of dollars. Dozens of late-night transfers. All those overtime shifts that had left me dead on my feet. And still, they had looked me in the eye and told me I wasn't doing enough. That night, I started writing everything down, not just the payments, but the memories. The night Mom called me crying when she first realized they were behind. The day Dad handed me the bank login info and told me I couldn't screw this up. The first time I saw Mark bring home a new car while I was wondering if I could afford groceries. It felt like pouring poison out of a wound. It hurt, but it also cleared my head. The next weekend, I skipped family dinner. When Mom called to ask why I wasn't there, I told her I was busy. She started to say something, probably about the payment, but I hung up before she could finish. Then I turned my phone off and went for a long walk. As I walked through the quiet streets, I realized something important. I wasn't just cutting them off out of anger anymore. I was preparing myself for what came next. Because if they thought they could force me to keep sacrificing for them, they were about to learn how wrong they were. I didn't have a clear plan yet, but I was starting to feel the shape of one forming. It wasn't just about refusing to pay. It was about making sure they couldn't use me again. Not emotionally, not financially, not in any way. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just going to be about walking away. This was going to be about taking back control completely. The turning point didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly, like light seeping under a door at dawn. After weeks of exhaustion, of letting my emotions chew me up from the inside, I woke up one morning and felt lighter. Not happy, not exactly, but sharper, clearer, like I could finally see the road in front of me instead of just stumbling forward in the dark. I started with the basics. I went through my bank accounts and changed every password. I went into the branch in person and removed my parents' access entirely, even though the teller gave me a strange look when I insisted on signing 3 separate confirmation forms. When I walked out of the bank that day, I actually smiled for the first time in months. The feeling of finally shutting that door behind me, of knowing they couldn't reach into my pockets again, was addictive. But I didn't stop there. I picked up more hours at work, but not because I needed the money for them anymore. This time I was doing it for me. Every extra shift, every late night, was money I put straight into savings. It was different now. I wasn't just surviving. I was building something. The first time I saw my savings account cross the 5-figure mark, I sat there staring at the screen with a lump in my throat. It wasn't a fortune, but it was mine. All mine, with that small cushion under me. I started making moves I'd been putting off for years. I upgraded my beat-up old car that had been barely limping along. Nothing flashy, just something reliable that didn't make me pray every time I turned the key. Then I started looking at apartments that weren't just temporary stops until I figured things out. I wanted somewhere I could breathe, somewhere that actually felt like home. By late spring, I'd signed a lease on a place that made me feel like I'd finally stepped into my own life. Hardwood floors, big windows, enough space for a real dining table instead of eating hunched over the counter. The first night I slept there, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thought, this is what it feels like to choose yourself. And the better things got for me, the worse my parents' calls became. The texts started piling up. First, little guilt trips. The house feels so empty without you. Then flat-out demands. We expect you to send your share of the payment this Friday. When I didn't respond, they escalated. Mom showed up at my work one afternoon, which nearly made my manager throw me out of the building. She tried to corner me in the parking lot, tears streaming down her face, begging me to be reasonable. Reasonable, I said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. You went into my bank account without asking. You stole from me. That was your father's decision, she whispered, like that made it any better. He's just scared. We're both scared. We could lose everything. I shook my head. I already lost everything when I realized you didn't respect me. You're asking for money, but what you really want is control. She cried harder, said she didn't recognize me anymore. I almost told her that was the point, that I wasn't the quiet, obedient Brandon who bent over backward to keep the peace. But I bit my tongue because I'd realized something. Every time I held my ground, they panicked just a little more. Every time I didn't answer the phone, every time I refused to engage, they lost a little more of the power they'd held over me for so long. And while part of me hated watching them struggle, another part of me, the part that had been crushed under their expectation for years, felt something dark and electric stirring. It was around this time that Mark reached out again, this time suggesting we grab coffee. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what he wanted. He looked more relaxed than the last time I'd seen him, but still uneasy, like he was caught in the middle of something he didn't want to be part of. They're desperate, he told me after a few minutes of small talk. Dad's talking about taking out a second loan, but the interest rates right now are terrible. He keeps saying if he would just come back to the table, it would all be fine. I stir my coffee slowly. That's not going to happen. I figured, Mark said. Then after a pause, they said some stuff about you that I didn't like, about how you owe them, because they let you stay there so long. I told them they were out of line. That caught me off guard. You did. He nodded. I'm not going to lie, Bran. I used to think they were right about you, that you were just dragging your feet while I was out there getting my life together. But now I see it differently. You were carrying them while they were praising me. Hearing him say that out loud was like someone letting fresh air into a locked room. Thanks, I said quietly. That's why I wanted to tell you this, he continued. I overheard Dad talking about calling the bank again, something about getting access to the equity in the house. I don't think he realizes how much danger he's putting them in. I sat back, my mind already spinning. Or maybe he does, I said. That night, I went home and started making copies of everything in my folder, physical and digital. I put the originals in a fireproof safe and emailed the files to myself. Then I started researching what legal options I had if they tried to drag me back into their mess. The deeper I went, the more I realized I had leverage, more than I'd ever imagined. I had proof of every payment I'd made, proof of the unauthorized withdrawals, and even the text where they demanded money after I told them I was done. And if push came to shove, I could show anyone, lawyers, courts, even extended family, exactly who had been keeping that house afloat all these years. By early summer, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. My savings account was growing faster than ever. My new apartment felt like a sanctuary, and I'd even started dating someone seriously for the first time in years. She was kind, patient, and didn't flinch when I told her about everything with my parents. You've been through hell, she told me one night when we were sitting on my couch. Papers from my folders spread across the coffee table. But you're still standing. You should be proud of that. I thought about that for a long time after she left. Proud. That was a word I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. And maybe it was time I finally did, because I was stronger now, independent. And if my parents still thought they could drag me back into the role of the dutiful son who would sacrifice everything to keep them comfortable, they were in for a rude awakening. I wasn't just ready to defend myself anymore. I was ready to go on the offensive. By the time summer was in full swing, the distance between me and my parents had stretched into something unrecognizable. We weren't just on different pages. We were living in different books entirely. They were still clinging to the idea that I'd eventually come around, that I'd crack under the guilt they kept trying to pile on. But what they didn't know was that every day apart made me stronger, more certain that walking away had been the right move. The shift really started one Saturday morning when I got a letter from the county recorder's office. At first, I thought it was junk mail, but when I tore it open and saw the header, Property Tax Assessment, I felt a spark of curiosity. It wasn't addressed to me personally, but because I was still listed as a contributor on the mortgage account. Thanks to those payments I'd made for 3 years, my name had been added as a contact of record. Inside was a notice showing the property taxes for my parents' house had spiked significantly due to a reassessment. The figure made my stomach flip. It was more than double what I remembered from last year. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the paper, feeling a mixture of dread and grim satisfaction. If they were already struggling, this was going to push them to the edge. But then something caught my eye. The notice listed the property's parcel number, and right below it, the official owner of record, Thomas and Elaine Harper, joint tenants, with Brandon Harper listed as lien holder. My breath caught. I'd completely forgotten that when I started covering those payments, the bank had added me as a partial lien holder on the property to secure my recurring contributions. At the time, it had seemed like a meaningless legal formality, just a way to make sure my payments counted as authorized. But now, staring at that line in black and white, I realized what it meant. I had legal standing. I wasn't just a helpful son sending money out of the goodness of my heart. I had a paper trail and an official claim, small but real, on the house. If my parents tried to refinance, sell, or even transfer ownership, my signature would likely be required. And suddenly, everything clicked into place. I spent the next few days digging deeper. I went online and pulled every public record I could find about the property, title history, liens, everything. I found the original mortgage documents, the date they'd nearly defaulted, and even the paperwork from when my payments first started showing up. The deeper I went, the more control I realized I had. I didn't have enough ownership to just take the house, of course, but I had enough to stop them from making big moves without me, enough to make sure they couldn't go behind my back and take out another loan using the house as collateral, enough to make sure that if things escalated, I had leverage. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I wasn't just reacting. I was preparing. I met with a lawyer a week later, an unassuming guy with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm, measured voice. I laid out everything. The payments, the unauthorized withdrawals, the property records, even the texts where my parents demanded money. He listened quietly, occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Brandon, you have a very strong case here. Technically, you could sue for reimbursement of every payment you've made. At minimum, you have the right to block any refinancing or sale without your consent. If they've accessed your bank account without authorization recently, you may even have grounds for a fraud claim." I let out a slow breath. So I'm not crazy. I'm not overreacting. "Not even close," he said with a faint smile. "If anything, you've been more patient than most people would be. You've got options. The question is just how far you want to take this." I left his office feeling strangely steady, like I'd just put on armor I didn't know I owned. I wasn't sure yet if I'd go as far as suing, but it felt good knowing I could. Meanwhile, life outside of this drama kept improving. My new apartment was finally starting to feel lived in, and my girlfriend and I had fallen into an easy rhythm. Weeknight dinners, lazy Sunday mornings, quiet evenings talking about the future. She was the first person I'd ever told the whole story to, and she didn't flinch. Instead, she encouraged me to think strategically about what came next. "You have the high ground now," she said one night as we sat on the couch going through my folder again. "The old you might have just cut them off and walked away, but you don't have to do that anymore. You can make them face what they did." And she was right. The final piece of the puzzle came one afternoon when Mark called me unexpectedly. He sounded tense. "Bran," he said, "I thought you should know. Dad tried to take out a home equity loan last week. The bank denied it because your name is on the account. He's furious." says you're holding the family hostage. I couldn't help the smile that crept across my face. Good, I said simply. Brandon, Mark said carefully, what are you going to do? I'm going to make sure they can't hurt me again, I said. And if that means stopping them from digging themselves into a deeper hole, then that's exactly what I'll do. After that call, I sat at my desk and drafted a letter. Not an emotional one, not an angry rant, just a clear, legally sound statement prepared with my lawyer's help, informing my parents that any future actions involving the property require my written consent. I printed it, signed it, and mailed a copy by certified post. When the delivery confirmation came through 2 days later, I felt an odd mix of adrenaline and calm. There was no going back now. I hadn't just removed myself from their control. I'd stepped into a position where I could control the situation entirely. And for the first time, I was ready to use that power. Because if they want to keep treating me like the family scapegoat, they were about to find out what happens when the scapegoat learns how to fight back. I waited until the end of the month to make my move. Timing was everything now, and I wanted the moment to sting, not out of cruelty, but because I needed them to finally feel the weight of what they had done to me. The first step was silence. I ignored every call, every text, every guilt-laced message that said things like, "Your father can't sleep," or, "We might lose the house, Brandon. Please think about what you're doing." I needed them unsettled, off balance, waiting for a response that wasn't coming. Then, 3 days before the next mortgage payment was due, I sent a single text to the family group chat. Meeting at the house. Saturday, 3 p.m. Everyone there. No explanation, no apology, just the time and place. When I pulled into the driveway that Saturday, Mark's car was already there along with Dad's truck. My chest tightened as I stepped out of my car, the folder of documents tucked under my arm. The air felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. Mom opened the door when I knocked. Her expression was a mix of relief and weariness. "Brandon," she said carefully, "we didn't know if you'd ever come back." "I'm not here for dinner," I said flatly, brushing past her and heading toward the living room. They were all waiting there. Mom perched on the edge of the couch, Dad in his recliner with his arms crossed, Mark standing with his hands shoved in his pockets. The air was thick with unspoken words. "Let's just get this over with," Dad said gruffly. I set the folder on the coffee table and began spreading the papers out one by one. Bank statements, payment confirmations, text message screenshots, and finally, the letter from my lawyer. "This," I said, tapping the first stack, "is every payment I made on this house for the last 3 years. This," I tapped the next pile, "is proof of the unauthorized withdrawals from my account after I told you to stop. And this," I held up the letter, "is a legal notice that no one touches this house. No refinancing, no selling, no loans without my written consent." Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Dad's face went red. Mark just looked from me to the table, his expression unreadable. "You had no right to do this," Dad growled. "Yes," I said evenly. "I did. Legally, I have standing on this property. Every dollar I paid gave me more. And now you can't make a single financial move without my permission. You're holding us hostage," Mom whispered. "No," I said, my voice calm, almost cold. "I'm protecting myself because you already proved you'd take from me without asking. This is today." I slid one final paper across the table, an itemized invoice of everything I had paid, down to the cent. "This is what I'm owed," I said. "I'm not asking you to pay it today. I'm not even demanding repayment at all. But from this moment forward, every penny I've already put into this house counts as equity. When you're gone, I get my share before this house is passed to anyone else. If you try to cut me out, this paperwork goes to court." Mom's eyes filled with tears. Dad slammed his fist against the arm of the chair. "You think you can threaten us in our own home?" "This isn't a threat," I said quietly. "It's a boundary, and if you cross it again, it becomes a lawsuit." The room went so still, I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Mark finally spoke. "He's right," he said softly. Dad whipped his head toward him. "Excuse me, he's right," Mark repeated, more firmly this time. "You've been leaning on him for years and treating him like dirt while he was bailing you out. This is the least you can do." For a moment, I thought Dad was going to explode. But then he just sank back into his chair, his jaw tight, saying nothing. I gathered the papers back into the folder, leaving only the legal letter and invoice on the table. "You can keep those," I said. "Consider them reminders." Then I stood, my heart steady in my chest, and walked toward the door. "Brandon," Mom said suddenly, her voice breaking. I paused but didn't turn around. "We just wanted what was best for the family," she said. I took a deep breath and finally looked back at her. So did I. The difference is I actually paid for it. And with that, I walked out. When I got back to my car, my hands were shaking, not with fear this time, but with something almost like relief. For the first time, I felt like I had finally been heard, not because they agreed with me, but because I had forced them to face the truth. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw all three of them standing in the doorway, watching me go. For once, I didn't feel like the kid who had earned their approval. I felt like the man who had just taken back control of his own life. And this time, I knew there was no going back. The next few weeks were strangely quiet, eerily so. After years of constant nagging, phone calls, and guilt trips, my parents seemed to vanish from my life almost completely. It was like they had taken a collective vow of silence. At first, I wondered if they were plotting something behind my back. But then the messages from Mark started coming in. "They're not taking it well," he texted me one night. "Dad hasn't spoken to anyone in days. Mom's barely getting out of bed." I stared at the message for a long time. The old me would have felt a pang of guilt, maybe even gone back over there to smooth things over. But this time I didn't. They weren't just upset. They were dealing with the fact that they couldn't control me anymore. That was their choice to sit with, not mine. Still, the fallout came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after that confrontation, I got a call from the bank. The woman on the line sounded nervous as she told me someone had tried to apply for another loan against the house again. She confirmed that because of the lien holder status, they had to call me before processing anything. "Should I block the application?" she asked. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Deny it. And please know in the file that any future attempts without my consent should be flagged." When I hung up, I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. They were still trying to go around me, still try to treat me like a problem to work around instead of a person to respect. That night, I drafted another letter, shorter this time, firmer. I reminded them that any further attempt to take out loans would be considered financial misconduct, and that I wouldn't hesitate to escalate legally. I sent the letter via certified mail again, and I knew from the delivery receipt that they got it 2 days later. This time, Dad called me. "Brandon," he said, his voice tight, "this has gone far enough. You're tearing this family apart." "No," I said calmly. "I'm stopping you from tearing me apart. There's a difference. You're going to regret this one day," he warned. I almost smiled at that. Maybe, but at least when that day comes, I'll still have my dignity and my savings. I hung up before he could reply. It was Mark who told me what happened next. A month later, he came by my apartment and sat at my kitchen table with a look that was equal parts frustration and reluctant admiration. "They sold the boat," he said. I blinked. "The boat?" He nodded. "And Dad's truck. They finally admitted they couldn't keep up with the payments. They're cutting back on everything. Mom even canceled her garden club membership. For a moment, I didn't know how to feel. There was a part of me that still wished they had chosen to work with me instead of against me. But another part, the part that had spent 3 years carrying them, felt a strange sense of justice. They were finally living within their means. Finally facing the reality I'd been facing all along. "Good," I said finally. "It's about time." Mark studied me for a long moment. "You know," he said, "I think they respect you now, even if they'll never admit it." I shrugged. Respect was never the point. Boundaries were. After that, things settled into a new normal. My parents and I didn't talk much, but when we did, the conversations were civil, almost businesslike. They stopped asking me for money. They stopped comparing me to Mark. And the next time I went over to the house, months later, I noticed something different. The tension was gone. Mom greeted me with a small, tentative smile, and Dad nodded stiffly when I walked in, but there was no lecture, no side comments. For the first time in years, we sat at that dining table and ate a meal in peace. As we were clearing the dishes, Dad stopped me in the hallway. He didn't meet my eyes when he spoke. "You did what you had to do," he said gruffly. "I get it now." I nodded once. "I know." And that was it. Not an apology, not exactly, but the closest he would ever come. When I left that night, I stood for a moment at the end of the driveway, looking back at the house. The porch light glowed softly against the dark, just like it had that night. I sat in my car, wondering if I'd ever come back. But this time, I didn't feel small. I felt whole. This was no longer the house that held me hostage. No longer the place I kept afloat at the expense of my own happiness. It was just a house, one I had helped save, but one that no longer defined me. As I got in my car and started the engine, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even bitter. I was free. And as I drove away, the thought that echoed in my mind wasn't about revenge or repayment or justice. It was simply this: they would never control me again. And that, more than anything else, was a victory I had been fighting for all along.